So today, I was sitting discussing old weird experiences with my sister, and she reminded me of a house that we used to live in Michigan that bled. It was a small single-story house that sat back off the gravel road in a cluster of trees. One afternoon, our aunt and cousins came over, and it was so nice out that we all sat out on the picnic table and in lawn chairs to visit outside. My mother had just made a large pitcher of iced tea, so she instructed me to go in and get the pitcher from the fridge and bring it out with some plastic glasses. I ran inside and grabbed the pitcher out of the fridge and took it out and then ran back in to get the glasses, and that's when I saw a drop of blood on the threshold of the kitchen floor. It was a big drop too, like about the size of a quarter and bright red. I thought to myself, great, I must have stepped on something and cut my foot, so I went into the bathroom and got a Kleenex and wiped the blood off the floor and then sat down and examined my feet. But there was nothing. No cuts, no blood, not even a scratch. I ran out to my mum with the glasses and I said, "Hey, Mum, someone must have cut their foot because there's a spot of blood on the floor in there." My mum asked if I cleaned it up and I said yes. My aunt then said for all the kids to check their feet and make sure that they weren't bleeding. All the kids did and none were found to have any cuts. My mum then says maybe it was a drop of tea that I spilt and just thought it was blood. I argued that no, I wiped it up and it definitely was blood. And nah, I'll even go get the Kleenex out of the trash and I'll show you. So I go inside to get the Kleenex and saw that there was another spot of blood on the floor in the exact same spot. I ran outside and said, "Hey Mum, come and have a look, there's another one." My mother said, "But I thought you said you cleaned it up." And I said, "I did, but there's another drop. Someone's bleeding and they just don't want to say anything." So my mother told me to go and clean the other drop of blood up and bring her the paper towel so that she could examine it. Then she ordered all the kids to form a line so that she could personally examine everyone's feet. I went inside and grabbed a paper towel and wiped up the drop of blood, but as I was wiping it, another drop fell and landed right on top of my head this time. I jumped back, looked up, and saw that the blood was coming from the ceiling. I screamed and ran outside, bumping into my mother as she was running in to see what had happened. I held out my hand with the bloody paper towel and the splotch of blood on the top of my hand, and my mum grabs my hand and says, "What did you do? How did you cut your hand?" I said, "Mum, no, I didn't cut myself. The house is bleeding." Mum and my aunt too by now, plus all the kids, were staring at me, and my mother says, "What? Don't be stupid. Houses don't bleed." I quickly pointed to the threshold where, by now, a small puddle of blood had appeared, maybe about a teaspoon worth, and they all looked, and my mum goes, "That's actually quite a bit of blood. Who's cut themselves?" I then point to the ceiling, and they see the fist-sized splotch of dark brownish red that seeped through the ceiling and is now dripping blood onto the floor. My aunt makes the sign of the cross upon herself. She was Catholic, and they do this as a means of protection and stuff, and says, "Oh my gosh," and then ushers her kids out the door and into the car. And then she stands in the doorway of the house and tells my mother that it's demonic, and she better get us kids out until a priest comes and blesses the house. And my mother looks at her like she's stupid and tisks her with a wave of her hand, and then my mum says, "Look, just give me a paper towel, okay?" And then she proceeds to wipe up the blood on the floor and gets a stepladder and wipes up the blood on the ceiling. We all watch to see if it bleeds again, but nothing happens right away. A few minutes later, the puddle started forming on the ceiling again and then dropped a bright red drop on the floor. My mum says that it has to be a dead squirrel that must have climbed in the attic and died or something. But being the smart and smart-ass kid that I was, I said, "But Mum, if it's dead, it wouldn't bleed fresh blood." She glares at me and gives me one of the "shut your mouth if you know what's good for you" glares and says, "Not if it just died. Just go and call your dad to come home and check the attic, okay?" My dad was down the street playing cards with the neighbours, so I call him and he acts frustrated but says okay and that he'll come home. A few minutes later, my dad pulls in and my mum explains what's happening. He gets a funny look on his face and tells me to get the hammer and the flashlight for him, so I do. He proceeds to unnail the attic door and I'm standing there watching him and ask why the door was nailed shut to begin with. He explains that when we first moved in, the attic door wouldn't stay closed. Then, my mean mum intrudes and tells me to leave my dad alone and go sit in the living room with the rest of the kids, so pouting, I do. So, long story short, they get the door open and head carefully up the stairs to the attic, which is just a single large room with a small painted shut window. They just get to the top of the steps when the door slams shut on them and my dad's flashlight dies, leaving them in the dark. My mum screams and I hear my dad yell, "Son of a bitch," and then the hammer bang on something. I run over and pull on the door to open it, but it refuses to open, and I tell my mum it's locked. My dad ends up kicking it open, splintering all the door into half, and they come rushing out, their faces drained of colour, and my mum scared half crazy. They boarded up the entire door with heavy plywood nailed excessively, and after that, it wasn't long before we packed up and moved, and years later, I heard the rest of the story. So, apparently, the attic was completely spotless, not even dust, and then suddenly, my dad's flashlight beam aimed at about where the blood was coming from fell on the figure of a dark hooded man kneeling on all fours. When the flashlight beam hit him, he allegedly lunged forward, growling a demonic growl. My dad yells "son of a bitch" and throws the hammer at it, and then they run down the stairs as the light went out. It wasn't until years later that my mother said that in the beginning someone had told them that the house was haunted, but the rent was so cheap and down the road from our friends that they just overlooked it. They also said that the door to the attic wouldn't stay closed and that if they locked it with the hook lock, they'd walk back into the kitchen and find the door wide open with the freezing cold air coming down the stairs, and so they took to putting a chair up against the doorknob to brace it shut. But one night, after we'd all gone to bed, something knocked on the attic door and just kept pounding on it like it was an emergency or something. My mum took a crucifix that had been soaked in holy water and had my dad nail it to the door, and the pounding apparently just stopped. The door was actually the kind that has lattice rungs on it for ventilation, and my mum swore that she once saw a huge eye staring back at her through the slats once when she went to peek through the door. She also felt constantly like she was being watched from that door, which is why she had it nailed completely shut in the first place. But the house bleeding was the last straw, and so we moved. After we moved, my parents would drive by and lights would be on in the attic, even though there was no electricity or wiring up there for lights, and one time as we passed, we saw a man in black standing in the light looking at the attic window. We stopped driving by there after that, and the house has stayed vacant for years. About 5 years ago, though, I went back to see if, as an adult, I could pick up on anything, and it looked the same as before, but people were living in it, and it looked like they had converted the attic into a bedroom because I could see a headboard and curtains. I did try and knock on the door, but no one answered, and maybe it's just as well. Anyway, I know that this is a strange story, but I was wondering, have any of you guys had a house or heard of a house that's bled? I'd be curious to know if it's common or if any of you can figure out why my house was bleeding.